Hey everyone, welcome to the fourth lesson of the Getting Started with Motion Graphics course here for Tuts Plus. My name is Vincent Nguyen, and today we're going to be taking a look at some trailer titles and how to create one in After Effects. So let's go ahead and take a look at what we're going to be creating today. So as you can see, a pretty effective and stylized title sequence for your short films or trailers and such. So now this is going to be our first approach, or my first approach, at helping you guys create a full, animation from start to finish from scratch. The past 2-3 episodes I've been talking about, motion graphics and just explaining and showing you guys things. But today I really want to sit down with you guys and really show you guys what it takes to create a pretty simple but effective animation from start to finish. So let's go ahead and create this project right now. So in After Effects here, let's go ahead and create a new composition. We're going to call this main comp, and I'm going to make it 720p at 10 seconds long, and make sure your background color is set to black and hit OK. So we have a nice blank composition here to work with. Let's go ahead and create a new solid layer so we have a background layer to work with. Let's hit Control or Command Y to make a new solid, and let's call this BG for background. Make comp size and hit OK. Now, the primary focus of this tutorial is trying to make a nice, fluid, multiple text transitions to make things flow together, as well as to give it a nice stylized, polished, and finished look. So with that being said, let's go ahead and start with our text first. To create a new text, you can either go to Layer, New Text, or just hit Control Alt Shift T or Command Option Shift T on the Mac. So by pressing that, we bring up the nice type tool. We can type in our text. I'm going to call this type. Now, if I turn on the title save, you can see that our text is not centered. And the easiest way to center things up is to go to the window up here, make sure that the align panel is checked, and go to your align panel right here and just select your text and just go ahead and center it up. You may recognize these tools from Photoshop or Illustrator. So pretty nice way to center things up really quickly with text and layers like that without manually having to do this. So I'm going to turn off the title save. So go ahead and make all of your size adjustments and change your font to whatever you want. I'm using Bank Gothic, a free font which you can find via Google. Let's go ahead and make this 3D layer by switching the modes and selecting this little cube icon right here. And hit P on the keyboard to show the position parameters. And let's go ahead and start animating this thing in the Z position. So I'm just going to drag this thing way back. And if you hold down the Shift key, you can actually decrease and increase the values at a larger increment. So just hold down Shift and just, barely enlarge it and barely pull the text way back behind the camera, just so enough that we don't see it anymore. You don't want to drag it all the way back because it's going to be too far back. Just barely enough so we don't see it anymore. Make sure you're at the beginning of the timeline and just hit the stopwatch for the keyframe. And if you hold down Shift and press page down, you can move at increments of 10 frames, as you see here. And go ahead and set the value down to 0. And that's just going to put the text back in the center of where it was before. So we kind of have this nice hit. And this is where we left off in the last lesson. So today we're really going to be focusing on creating multiple, transition of these kind of impact flyby titles, really make things flow and make it look really nice. So let's go ahead and finish this thing off by giving it a few seconds to kind of just sit there so we can read it. So about 2 seconds long, let's go ahead and hit another keyframe right here. Move 10 frames, Shift page down. And we're just going to pull this thing way back by holding Shift key and just kind of pull it back. So what we have here is a nice flyby title. We also want to apply some nice opacity keyframes to this to kind of just fade things out. We want things to be very, very subtle and very, very smooth. So I'm just going to zoom in here. And we want to fade this thing out right when it starts to kind of zoom out. So at this point right here, this is where our type kind of starts moving out. So let's go ahead and select our text layer, press T on the keyboard to show the opacity, and hit a stopwatch keyframe. If you hit U on the keyboard to show all the keyframes, let's go ahead and move forward to the very last keyframe. And this is where our type kind of just fades out. So let's go ahead and set the opacity down to 0. So now if we take a look at this, we have our nice type fly in. It kind of stays still, starts hanging around, and then it's going to fade out while moving back to kind of give it that nice fluid and soft kind of transition out. So this is looking great, but you can see that our text is kind of staying still. I mean, if you do a quick RAM preview, you see that it just kind of sits there. It looks really awkward. And if you remember what I said before, we don't want to keep things still. We always want things moving, because when people pay for, a broadcast spot or, a television ad, it costs a lot of money for that nice 10, 15, 30-second spot. And we want to make use of that, that really short 15, 30-second spot. So we want things to keep on moving. We don't want to waste time. We don't want to keep things still. So we can apply some nice tracking to this to give it a subtle movement like what I did before in the previous lesson. But in this particular case, let's go ahead and take a look at another method, which is using the camera tool. So let's go ahead and create a new camera. Layer, new camera. We're going to call this camera and hit OK. And it's going to create a camera, and we can use this thing to kind of animate the camera around our text because our text is 3D. So we're going to hit P on the keyboard for the camera position. And I'm going to go ahead and start the very beginning of the timeline right here. Hit a keyframe, stopwatch, move to the end of the composition, and just kind of pull it forward. So now if you take a look, we have a nice flyby, and then our text is going to kind of zoom forward a little bit. And you see that the text kind of moves forward. The text is not actually moving forward. The camera is actually getting closer to the text. So it kind of gives it the illusion that the text is kind of moving. And we may want to decrease the value just a little bit. It's kind of zooming too much. Maybe just a little bit more. Just so we have some nice subtle effects. And remember, you want to do all the stylizing and all this first, and then you want to start duplicating the text. So the type looks really good right now. Let's go ahead and make this thing look a little bit nicer by applying some nice layer styles. So layer styles are a little bit different. When you apply layer styles to text or layers, some effects don't really work too well, but I'll explain that later in the tutorial. So let's go ahead and apply some layer styles. We can apply some layer styles by going to Layer and Layer Styles. And all these layer styles are all similar to Photoshop and stuff like that. So let's go ahead and apply a nice gradient overlay. And then we can go into the gradient overlay parameter and go ahead and edit the gradient. And then we can change the white color to a nice dark gray. And then we can change the black to a nice white tone, just to kind of give it this nice kind of metal chrome look. Like that. And then we can apply a nice bevel. So layer, and we're going to go to layer styles, bevel and emboss, close gradient overlay, open the bevel and emboss, and let's go ahead and set the size to 2, just very subtle. And we can just leave it like that. So now we have this nice gradient, we have this nice bevel, and our whole animation is looking pretty sweet. So now what we're missing is some nice background light. Now in the original demonstration, I used these nice kind of light rays here, and we can easily achieve that by applying a nice CC light ray in the effects and presets. Go ahead and drag the CC light rays into the type. So now we get this nice light ray here. And we can go ahead and animate this. Now remember, you want to keep things somewhat subtle. So let's go ahead and, position the center of the light sweep kind of on the left side of the center of the text. And we're going to go to the beginning. Hit U on the keyboard. Let's go ahead and start right here. This is where the type starts to kind of stay still. So we want to animate it right here. So we're going to hit a stopwatch for the center of the light ray. We're going to move forward to about right here when it starts moving again. And we're just going to push this thing a little bit to the right. So it's not really moving much, but it kind of gives it that subtle gleam. And again, that's what we want. We want some subtle movement. So as you can see, we had this nice light gleam that kind of just swipes across our text. Very nice, very fluid, and very slowly. And then kind of just zooms out. And just like that, we're pretty much done. Of course, you can tweak with the light ray settings if you wish. Now, to duplicate this text and create a nice title sequence, we can actually just simply duplicate the text. Let's go ahead and close this. Let's go ahead and trim down the layer a little bit so we kind of get a nice brief sense of how long this thing is. So we're going to go ahead and hit Control Command D to duplicate it. Of course, you can go to Edit, Duplicate. So what we want to do is align the second text to make it appear right when the previous text starts to disappear. So at this point right here, this is when our text is going to start to disappear. So we want to go ahead and start the second text about right here as well. And then once the text fully fades out, we want the second text to already be there. So let's go ahead and change this type right here to something else. Let's just type whatever. And then if we do a quick RAM preview, you have this pretty cool and nice sequence here. And everything is kind of abrupt right now. Everything is just kind of slapping on. It's all of a sudden stopping, and then it's all of a sudden, zooming out. So we want to kind of smooth these keyframes out so it won't be so linear. We want a nice Bezier curve. And the easiest way to kind of ease your keyframes in is to highlight the keyframes. I'm going to highlight these two. And then I'm going to hit F9 or go to Animation, Keyframe Assistance, Easy Ease. And that's just going to ease the keyframes in so it's not so abrupt. And I'm going to do these for these keyframes as well. Animation, Keyframe Assistance, and Easy Ease, or F9. And again, it's just going to smooth the animations together. Let's just do this thing one more time. So let's go ahead and duplicate this text layer and just drag it into position here. So when one starts to leave, one starts to begin. Approximately right here. And we're going to change this text to "you want." Let's go ahead and just edit the camera keyframes a little bit. Move this back. And then we're going to move this back as well. So our sequence is starting to look really, really nice and really smooth. But the only problem is that everything looks too sharp. As you see here, we have tons and tons of really fast movement. And there's no motion blur. So we can quickly enable motion blur by enabling the composition motion blur. We're just going to enable the motion blur for the whole composition. And then we can enable motion blur for the individual layers. So go ahead and enable motion blur for these 3 layers by hitting this kind of 3 circle sphere motion blur switch. And now you start to see this really nice motion blur. And motion blur is just as important in motion graphics as it is in visual effects. So that really starts to sell the effect of some nice fast moving type, and it makes a huge difference in the whole animation overall. So now that we have our text set up, let's go ahead and take a look at how we can make this thing look a little bit more, polished. And we're going to start off with the background. Now, like I said before in the previous lesson, the fractal noise is a very, very powerful, plugin. You can do a lot of it with motion graphics and visual effects. And if you believe it or not, this whole background texture right here was not created using a texture or an image from anywhere else. It's actually created within After Effects using the fractal noise. So back into our main composition, let's go ahead and set this up. I'm going to create another new solid. Control Command Y, and let's call this fractal texture. And we're simply going to be using the fractal noise as somewhat of a texture. So dragging the fractal noise in under noise and grain. And at first glance, you would think that this plugin or this effect is not very, useful. It's just some weird cloud effects similar to the Photoshop one. And you can actually create a lot of things with the fractal noise, such as fire, cloud, smoke. In this case, we're going to be using a texture. So for the fractal type, let's go ahead and set this thing to dynamic. to kind of give it that nice puffy feeling to it. We're going to decrease the contrast to about 20, so it's not too contrasty. And then we're really going to lower down the brightness. We want it to be kind of dark. Maybe around -47. We're going to change the complexity to about 8, so there's kind of more detail in the clouds. And then we're going to go to the transform. And then we're going to scale this thing up a little bit. We don't want these miniature clouds. We want some pretty large clouds as a background. And right now the clouds are staying still. And from what I said before, remember, we want some subtle movement. We don't want things to be staying still. So to apply some nice movement, we can change the evolution right here. And that's just going to involve the clouds over time. And we can do this with keyframes. I'm going to do a really quick expression that you should all know. I'm going to hold down Alt or Option and just click on the evolution stopwatch. Once again, Alt or Option, click. And type in time asterisk 80. And this is going to times the value by the time times 80. That's going to cause the evolution to animate over time automatically without really any keyframes. Pretty useful expression. So now that we have our fractal noise set up, it looks kind of ugly, but let's go ahead and drag it, above our background layer. So now we can see our type. And let's go ahead and mask this thing out. So if you remember from the previous lesson, to use a mask, let's go ahead and go to the mask tool right here. And by default, you should have the rectangle tool. If we click and hold, we can select the ellipse tool and just draw a nice ellipse around our text. And it doesn't need to be perfect. We can go ahead and hit F on the keyboard to bring up the mask feather. And go ahead and feather this thing out. And then we can hit M again to bring up all the mask properties. And we can just go ahead and increase the mask expansion. You can see what it does here. It kind of just expands our mask. That's the reason why we don't really need our mask to be exactly perfect. So just get it somewhere that looks pretty right. Make it somewhat like a vignette effect. And again, just like visual effects and cinematography, we use a lot of vignettes and motion graphics as well. So just like that, we created this kind of soft and subtle texture for our background layer. We can go ahead and adjust some of the settings in the fractal noise. Like that. And in the original demonstration, I used a fractal noise, but I also use a nice bright lens flare. Now, lens flares are a really popular style nowadays, especially in visual effects and motion graphics. Kind of the new trend, I guess. Now, there are awesome plugins out there for lens flares. There's actually a pretty crummy one in After Effects built in, but let me go ahead and show you what this is. So let's go ahead and create a new solid layer. Control Command Y, and then we're going to call this lens flare. Make sure it's set to pure black and hit OK. And we can search in the lens flare effect. Drag that in there. And we get this pretty default nasty, old school lens flare that hasn't been updated for years, especially in Photoshop. So we're going to set the lens type to 105mm prime, which is just going to give you the nice bright white lens flare. And then we can set the blending modes here. And just toggle the switches, change the blending mode from normal to add. And that's just going to add the colors into our scene so we can see the rest of our background layer. So if we just adjust this to the very top and just increase the brightness. Kind of pull it up a little bit. And just bring it underneath all of our text layer. You kind of create this nice bright white background. And then, I'm not really liking the kind of iris of this whole lens flare. So I'm going to go ahead and mask this thing out. So again, with the elliptical mask tool, let's go ahead and just kind of crop things out. Right there. Hit F on the keyboard to feather things out. And we can just, tweak some of these things. Something like that. So we have this nice subtle background. And now it's kind of missing that drop shadow. So we can quickly apply a drop shadow by going back to the layer styles. applying a nice drop shadow. And then we can set the, let's go to our text here, the first one. And let's go ahead and, change the angle a little bit for the drop shadow here. Maybe 120. Maybe increase the distance a little bit. And then change the size. And then we're going to decrease the opacity, just so it's very, very subtle. And then we can copy the drop shadow. Just click on the drop shadow, copy it, Control Command C, and just paste it to the rest of our text layer. So you get this very nice and subtle drop shadow here. And that's pretty much all you have to do to create this pretty basic trailer title sequence. Now, in the original demonstration, I added these kind of nice cinematic letterboxing to kind of give it a nice finished look and that cinematic focused look. So you can either render it out with the wrong aspect ratio, or you can manually create these. To create these, go ahead and create another new solid layer, Control Command Y, and call this letterboxing. And then let's go ahead and turn on the title safe, just so we have a reference right here, and get the rectangle tool and go ahead and draw a pretty even mask as such. Now right now the mask is masking out what we selected, so it's pretty much cropping what we have. We actually want to subtract what we have and cut this part out and leave the rest remaining. So we're going to change the mask from add to subtract. We're going to turn off the title safe and go ahead and click away, and just like that you created this pretty nice letterboxing. Kind of gives it that nice finished focused look on our animation. And I like to add letterboxing whenever I can. Looks pretty cool in my opinion. More of a personal visual style, I guess. So as you can see, just like that, you created this really nice and effective but stylized kind of title sequence for your short film, for your trailer and such. So a pretty basic technique, but a very, very effective technique. And I think it's a really great way to kind of start your learning experience with motion graphics by creating some basic trailer title sequences. So really basic technique. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. And I really encourage you guys to kind of play around with the effects that you saw and play around with the different styles and play around with all the different effects in After Effects to kind of achieve a different look. Don't be afraid to change the colors of things, to change the fractal noise, change the lens flares. You can even apply the CC light sweep that I talked about in the last tutorial to kind of give it that nice metal gleam, and it would work perfectly for this text because we have this nice gradient over it. So just try things out, tweak around with it. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this tutorial. I'm sorry for my fast pace. It's just so much to get out in so little time, but hopefully you guys enjoyed this lesson. In the next lesson, we're going to be talking about some shapes, masks, and vectors in After Effects to create some pretty cool motion graphics, so definitely check that out. If you guys have any other questions, don't hesitate to leave them in the forums. I would definitely get to them as soon as I can. And again, hopefully you guys enjoyed this tutorial. I'll see you guys in the next lesson. Bye guys.